The continued existence of the Army School of the Americas serves one single purpose, and that is to sustain and promote a wealthy, elite ruling class as the dominant players in their own countries, in control of their social structure, their economies, and their international relations.
The School of the Americas was a U.S. Army training school for members of Central and South American militaries. Originally established in 1946 in Panama, the SOA was later moved to Fort Benning, Georgia in 1984. By the year 2000, it had trained over 60,000 Latin American personnel. The actions of many of these graduates would constitute some of the most grievous human rights abuses in the Western Hemisphere, and earned the school nicknames such as the School of Coups and the School of Assassins. In 1996, the US government declassified several training manuals used by the School of the Americas. The manuals were found to advocate the use of torture, blackmail, and execution against opponents. Students trained in counterinsurgency were instructed to identify targets for neutralization. Targets such as government officials, political leaders, and members of the infrastructure. The torture methods used by SOA graduates mirrored what US interrogators employed in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. Sleep deprivation, being kept naked in extremes of temperature, long periods of isolation, cold water being thrown on subjects at regular intervals, electric shocks, threats against family members, beatings, and sexual assault. In 1981, in the Salvadoran village of El Mozote, over 900 civilians, including at least 500 children, were murdered by the Salvadoran military. The group that carried out the massacre was the Atlacatl Battalion, a creation of US funding and training. The commander of the Atlacatl Battalion was Colonel José Domingo Monterosa, a graduate of the School of the Americas. When Monterosa was questioned about El Mozote by an American journalist, he stated, "Yeah, we did it. We carried out a limpieza, a social cleansing there. We killed everyone." Among the other officers of the Atlacatl Battalion who were SOA graduates were Major Natividad de Jesus Cáceres, General José Guillermo Garcia, Colonel Ernesto Méndez Rodriguez, and Captain Walter Oswaldo Salazar. In 2020, another graduate of the SOA, former Salvadoran Air Force Commander Juan Rafael Bustillo, admitted to a court hearing that Monterosa and the Atlacatl Battalion were responsible for the massacre at El Mozote.
Retired Salvadoran General Juan Rafael Bustillo has acknowledged for the first time that elite United States trained forces were responsible for carrying out the 1981 El Mozote massacre, in which nearly 1,000 unarmed villagers were killed. Most of those tortured and murdered by the US-backed troops were women and children. Like the El Mozote massacre, the killing of the priests was also carried out by the soldiers trained by the United States.
Another atrocity committed by the Atlacatl Battalion that drew international attention was the 1989 murder of 8 people on the campus of the Central American University. The victims were 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and the housekeeper's 16-year-old daughter. In 2020, a Spanish court sentenced former Salvadoran Colonel Inocente Orlando Montano to 133 years in prison for the killings. Montano, along with 5 other officers involved in the killings, were all graduates of the SOA. Another notorious SOA graduate that operated death squads in El Salvador was Roberto de Orbison. He was involved in the infamous murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero in 1980. Romero was an outspoken critic of the Salvadoran government's brutality and repression. A month before he was killed, Romero had written an open letter to US President Jimmy Carter, appealing to him to cut off military aid to El Salvador. In addition to his training at the SOA, d'Aubusson received extensive training in intelligence and security operations while he was in the US. He was also trained at the International Police Academy in Washington. Similar to the SOA, the police academy trained foreign officers in methods of torture, with many South American death squads being formed by graduates of the academy. In 1980, 4 American missionaries working in El Salvador were abducted, raped, and executed by a group of Salvadoran soldiers. A 1993 UN investigation found that 3 SOA graduates were responsible for the planning and ordering of the murders: Luis Antonio Colindres Alaman, Carlos Eugenio Vides Casanova, and his cousin, Oscar Edgardo Casanova Veja. Another SOA graduate, the Salvadoran Defense Minister, General Jose Guillermo Garcia, had tried to cover up the incident. Battalion 316 was responsible for kidnapping, torturing, and murdering hundreds of people throughout Honduras in the 1980s, including the American missionary, Father James Carney. Several former members of the battalion gave accounts of how they dealt with their victims, using methods such as suffocation, genital mutilation, and threatening to rape and torture family members. The battalion's soldiers also stated that they had been flown to the US and received extensive training from the CIA at a secret location in Texas.
General Alvarez was the administration's man in Honduras. He supported Pentagon policy, he gave the CIA a free hand there, and the White House smiled on his anti-communist rhetoric. During his 2 years as Honduran Chief of Staff, the United States built a half a dozen airfields, 2 radar sites, and a training base. The number of American soldiers went from 45 to 2,000. His exile to Costa Rica this morning comes on the eve of yet more war games with the United States and Honduran troops, and at a time when CIA-supported rebels operating from Honduras are having success against Nicaragua. So far, no one has given a reason why Alvarez fell out of favor with other officers.
The organizer and director of Battalion 316 was General Gustavo Alvarez Martinez, a graduate of the SOA. In 1983, Martinez was awarded the Legion of Merit by Ronald Reagan, despite reports of his involvement with death squads. From the late 80s to the early 90s in Colombia, a series of massacres were perpetrated against the citizens of Trujillo. Hundreds of people suspected of supporting the FARC guerrillas were tortured and executed. One of the main perpetrators of the massacres was the commander of the Colombian Army's Palace Battalion, Major Alirio Antonio Urueña Jaramillo.
Atención, hay noticia de última hora desde los juzgados especializados en Bogotá. Un alto oficial del ejército fue condenado por más de 200 asesinatos en la llamada masacre de Trujillo Valle. Julián Ríos, ¿de quién se trata, Julián?
Sí, buenas tardes, mucha atención que Noticias Caracol conoció de manera exclusiva esta providencia de 120 páginas mediante las cuales se condena al mayor en retiro Alirio Antonio Ureña Jaramillo a una pena de 44 años de cárcel. Un juez especializado aquí en el centro de Bogotá lo ha encontrado culpable de la masacre de Trujillo Valle en 1990. Según el juzgado, este mayor en retiro se habría aliado con narcotraficantes, habría conformado un grupo paramilitar para asesinar a más de 200 personas entre 1988 y 1990. Estas personas, como ustedes recuerdan, fueron apareciendo asesinadas en el río Cauca.
Eyewitnesses stated that Urueña personally directed the torture of at least 11 victims and executed them by cutting off their limbs and heads with a chainsaw. Urueña attended the SOA in 1976. He also underwent intelligence officer training sponsored by the US Defense Intelligence Agency. Another senior Palace Battalion officer, Lieutenant Colonel Luis Felipe Becerra Bojorquez, commanded the soldiers who committed the 1993 Riofrio massacre. 13 unarmed peasants were dragged out of their homes, interrogated, tortured, and executed. Bojorquez was also involved in 2 other massacres in the Uraba region. He attended the SOA in 1968. In 1990 and 1991, the SOA invited a guest speaker to address the students of the school. The speaker was Colombian General Farouk Yanin Diaz. He was invited despite being surrounded by allegations of his direct involvement in several massacres, one of which being the 1987 massacre of 19 merchants in the Colombian province of Santander. Diaz was arrested in 1996 for his role in the Santander massacre, after he returned from a trip to the US, where he was working as an advisor to the Inter-American Defense College in Washington, D.C.
Por favor, señores de la subversión, tomen nota de lo siguiente. Solo el ejército de Guatemala debe tener las armas. Ustedes dejen las armas. Porque si no dejan las armas, nosotros les vamos a quitar las armas. Y oigan más, oigan bien, señores. No aparecerán más asesinados en las orillas de las carreteras. Se irá a fusilar a quien esté en contra de la ley.
In the early 1980s, Guatemala was ruled by Efrain Rios Montt. Montt oversaw the period in Guatemalan history known as the Silent Holocaust, when thousands of Mayan citizens were brutally and systematically murdered by the military. Approximately 440 villages were destroyed as a result of Montt's guns and beans policy. The policy was a simple ultimatum to the Guatemalan people. If you are with us, we will feed you. If not, we will kill you. In 2013, Montt was put on trial. He was found guilty of genocide and sentenced to 80 years in prison. However, the ruling was overturned shortly afterwards. Montt was trained at the School of the Americas. During Montt's presidency, another SOA graduate was implementing the guns and beans policy as an officer of the Guatemalan military. Major, later General Otto Perez Molina, became president of Guatemala in 2012. Former soldiers under his command in the 1980s have come forward and accused him of ordering the burning and looting of villages.
Yes, the senior officer, the commander in Neba, was a man who used the code name Mayor Tito, Major Tito. It turns out that man's real name was Otto Perez Molina. Otto Perez Molina later ascended to general, and today he is the president of Guatemala. So he is the one who was the local implementer of the program of genocide which Rios Montt is accused of carrying out.
Julio Roberto Alperez was a Guatemalan army colonel who attended the School of the Americas in 1970. He was also a longtime asset of the CIA, receiving tens of thousands of dollars a year from them. In 1996, Alperez was implicated in the 1990 murder of innkeeper Michael Devine and the 1992 murder of guerrilla leader Efrain Velasquez. The cases drew attention in America as Devine was a US citizen and Bamaca was married to a US citizen. When Alperez first fell under suspicion of the extrajudicial murder of Bamaca in 1992, the CIA claimed to have ended their relationship with him, but not before paying him $44,000 in severance. General Hector Gramajo was the Minister of Defense for Guatemala from 1987 to 1990 and a graduate of the SOA. In 1991, Gramajo gave a commencement address at the SOA, 6 months after he had been taken to court for 2 cases involving torture, one of which was the abduction, rape, and torture of Ursuline nun Diana Ortiz by soldiers under Gramajo's command. He was eventually found responsible in both cases and ordered to pay $47.5 million to the victims. In an interview Gramajo gave in 1991, he described the military strategy he employed in Guatemala, the thesis of national stability. Part of the thesis was the application of a 30-70 formula. We aren't renouncing the use of force. If we have to use it, we have to use it, but in a more sophisticated manner. You needn't kill everyone to complete the job. We instituted civil affairs in 1982, which provides development for 70% of the population, while we kill 30%. Before, the strategy was to kill 100%. In a very similar case to the murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, Guatemalan Bishop Juan José Gerardi Conadera was bludgeoned to death in 1998, 2 days after he had released a report condemning the Guatemalan military for massacres of the Mayan population.
Después de 2 años de investigación, el 20 de enero del 2000, los tribunales encontraron culpables al coronel Lima Estrada, su hijo Byron Lima Oliva, al especialista del ejército Obdulio Villanueva y al padre Orantes por estar vinculados al cruel asesinato que, según fuentes oficiales, fue de carácter político. Meses antes de su muerte, en una entrevista, Gerardi manifestó que las amenazas contra la Oficina de los Derechos Humanos del Arzobispado se intimidaría y que lo que no quería era un enfrentamiento entre la Iglesia Católica y el gobierno de Álvaro Anzú.
In 2001, Colonel Byron Disrael Lima Estrada, the former chief of military intelligence, was convicted of Bishop Gerardi's murder. He had been trained at the SOA in 1968. Throughout the 1990s, Peru was nominally ruled by President Alberto Fujimori. In 2009, he was convicted of ordering 2 massacres during his tenure and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Although Fujimori held the office of president, the person acknowledged to be the real power broker in Peru during that time was the Director of National Intelligence, Vladimiro Montesinos. Montesinos supervised the activities of the Colina Group, a death squad responsible for the Barrios Altos, La Cantuta, Santa, and Patavilca massacres. The Colina Group was led by Major Santiago Martin Rivas.
El 13 de noviembre, el propio Martin Rivas dio la pista. Paradójicamente, el más obsesivo de sus hobbies lo llevaría a la prisión. A mediados del año pasado, la Dirección de Inteligencia del Ministerio del Interior tuvo una nueva tarea. Con Montesinos capturado y tras las rejas, su misión fue detener a los integrantes del temible grupo Colina. El objetivo principal, el mayor en retiro del ejército peruano, Santiago Enrique Martín Rivas, 45 años, 1,65 de estatura.
Estado civil, soltero.
Trujillano. Cargos en su contra: el asesinato de 9 estudiantes y un profesor de la Universidad de La Cantuta, la matanza de 15 personas en el Jirón Guanta en Barrios Altos, el descuartizamiento del agente del CIE Mariela Barreto y la desaparición de un grupo de campesinos del Valle del Santa.
Both Vladimiro Montesinos and Santiago Martin Rivas were graduates of the School of the Americas. Montesinos had a long working relationship with the CIA, receiving millions of dollars from them. In February 2024, Montesinos was sentenced to 19 years in prison for his role in the Patavilca killings.
The Minister of Cocaine is the central figure in the most lucrative cocaine operation in the world, in Bolivia, source of 80% of the cocaine on this earth. Because it's an illegal business operating from a foreign country, it's impossible to pinpoint exactly how much money he and his countrymen make from the drug trade. The best guess is that it's around $1 billion a year, and the man you're about to meet has been taking a big personal cut of that. His name is Luis Arce Gomez, or more precisely, Colonel Luis Arce Gomez. Until just 3 days ago, he was Minister of the Interior in the government of Bolivia. He was the man charged with enforcing his country's drug laws, though he is himself a drug dealer.
Colonel Luis Arce Gomez was the Bolivian Minister of the Interior in the early 1980s. Under Gomez, political opposition was brutally repressed, and the drug cartels were given free rein to operate, provided they pay their dues to him. His actions earned him the colloquial title of Minister for Cocaine. Gomez even hired Nazi war criminal and U.S. intelligence asset Klaus Barbie as an advisor. In 1993, Gomez was sentenced to 30 years in prison for a series of crimes including assassination and genocide. He was a graduate of the SOA. Major Joseph Blair was a logistics instructor at the School of the Americas from 1986 to 1989. In the 1990s, he spoke out against the SOA. He claimed that the school was laundering drug money via the students.
In the time I spent at the School of the Americas, it was common knowledge to Army officers that it was the best place a Latin American officer could go to launder his drug money, or launder any other money he misappropriated in his own country from illegal operations. I routinely took the Latin American Army faculty members and their students to the 2 U.S. banks on Fort Benning, where the School of the Americas is located. The Latin American military would routinely bring, on average, from $25,000 to $35,000 cash in their pockets. Clearly, the money was drug money.
Blair joined protests against the SOA, organized by School of the Americas Watch, a group that demanded the closure of the school. The protests often led to a slew of arrests and harsh jail sentences. From 1990 to 2004, protesters spent a combined total of 85 years in prison. Following the public release of the SOA manuals in the late 1990s, an effort to shut down the SOA was spearheaded by Representative Joe Moakley and Senator Joe Kennedy. They highlighted the sheer number of SOA graduates that were responsible for human rights violations in Central and South America.
Almost every major human rights violation that has occurred in Latin America in the last 15 or 20 years has one thing in common, that the perpetrators of those crimes all graduated from the School of the Americas.
We come here today, a half century later, to say it's time to shut the school down. Last week, the Pentagon revealed what activists opposed to the school had been alleging for years, that foreign military officers were taught to torture and murder to achieve their political objectives.
On December 15, 2000, the School of the Americas was officially shut down. However, it reopened just 1 month later in the same location under the new name of the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, or WHINSEC. The change of name did little to divert the school from its original mission. Bloodstained hands were once again filing through the doors of Fort Benning. Waldo Abarracin, a prominent human rights lawyer in Bolivia, was kidnapped and tortured in 1997. One of the perpetrators was Captain Filman Urzagaste Rodriguez. Despite this, Urzagaste took a 49-week course at WHINSEC in 2002. Colombian Colonel Santiago Herrera Fajardo taught at WHINSEC in 2005. He was the commander of the 15th Mobile Brigade and was put on trial in 2015 for a series of extrajudicial murders committed between 2006 and 2008. Herrera's superiors, General Mario Montoya and General Jaime Lasprilla Villamizar, were also instructors at Fort Benning. In 2021, Haitian President Jovenel Moise was assassinated. 4 of the people involved were veterans of the Colombian military. They had been trained at WHINSEC.